The wagon wheels creaked against the frozen Colorado ground as Rebecca Whitmore clutched her only possessions, a worn cloth bag containing 2 dresses, a hairbrush, and the last letter her grandmother had written before dying. Through the canvas covering, she could hear her father's voice growing louder with each passing minute, advertising her like livestock at Morrison's trading post. She's 23, strong as an ox, can read and write better than most men in these parts, Harold Whitmore announced to the gathering crowd. 3 years married to Thomas Brennan back in Kansas. Not one child to show for it, but the doctor says she's healthy otherwise. Rebecca pressed her eye to a small tear in the canvas. Men circled the wagon like vultures, some with hungry eyes that made her stomach turn, others with faces that promised nothing but cruelty. She recognized the type men who saw women as nothing more than unpaid servants who warmed their beds. What's wrong with her? Called out Pete Morrison, the trading post owner whose reputation for beating his workers was well known throughout the valley. Nothing wrong exactly, her father replied, spitting tobacco juice into the dirt. Just can't seem to make babies. Doctor back in Kansas said insides don't work right for that particular job. The word job hit Rebecca like a slap. Her worth reduced to a single biological function she couldn't perform. $50 and she's yours. Harold continued. That's fair for damaged goods that can still cook, clean, and follow orders. Rebecca's hands shook as she heard the bidding begin. 50 became 60, then 70. Men haggled over her like she was a broken plow they might fix for cheap labor. The autumn wind whipped through gaps in the wagon cover, and she shivered, knowing this moment would determine whether she lived or merely survived. But then, a different voice cut through the crowd calm, measured and strangely respectful. What's her name? The question surprised everyone, including Harold. Name? Rebecca, I suppose. Rebecca Whitmore. What's it matter? She answered to whatever you call her. It matters to me, the man said firmly. Rebecca felt her heart skip. No one had asked her name in months. Her own husband had called her woman or wife, but never Rebecca, especially after the doctor delivered his verdict about her barren condition. Her parents had started calling her the burden when they thought she wasn't listening. Can she speak for herself? The man asked. Harold's face reddened with annoyance. Course she can speak. Too much, if you ask me. Always asking questions, always reading those books instead of focusing on women's work. Probably why she can't do what she's supposed to do. Miss Rebecca, the stranger said gently, would you please come out here? Please. The word felt foreign after years of commands and demands. Rebecca took a shaking breath and pushed through the canvas opening. Sunlight hurt her eyes after the dark wagon interior. She blinked and saw all the men staring, some disappointed by her appearance, others nodding approval. But the man who had spoken stood apart from the group, tall with dark hair and serious eyes that held something she hadn't seen in years. Kindness. Miss Rebecca, he said, removing his hat respectfully. My name is Daniel McCreary. I have 5 children and a farm about 10 miles from here. I need help caring for my family. Would you be willing to come work for us? Work for them. Not belong to them. Not be owned by them. Rebecca looked at her father, whose face had turned purple with anger at this unusual negotiation. She looked at the other men, whispering about Daniel's strange behavior. Then she met Daniel's eyes again and saw patience there. The first patience anyone had shown her in 3 long years. Yes, sir, she whispered. I'd be willing. Daniel nodded and pulled more money from his pocket than Rebecca had ever seen in one place. But instead of immediately walking away after paying Harold, he turned back to her. Do you have everything you need from the wagon? Rebecca held up her small bag. This is everything. Daniel's expression darkened as he studied her meager possessions, then looked back at Harold with barely concealed disgust. That's all her belongings? She doesn't need much, Harold said quickly. never was one for fancy things. But Daniel was looking at Rebecca, not her father. "Is there anything else you'd like to take? Anything that belongs to you?" Rebecca thought about her mother's rocking chair sitting in their cabin, about the small garden she'd planted behind the house, about her favorite hiding spot by the creek where she used to read books in peace. All lost to her now. "No, sir," she said quietly. "Nothing else belongs to me." Daniel studied her face for a long moment, and she saw something flicker in his eyes, understanding perhaps, or sorrow for all she'd lost. Then he did something that shocked everyone present. He took off his own warm coat and wrapped it around her shoulders. "Well then," he said, "let's go home." As they walked toward his horse and wagon, Rebecca heard her father calling after them. "She's your problem now, McCreary. Don't come crying to me when she disappoints you." Rebecca didn't look back. For the first time in 3 years, she was walking towards something instead of being dragged away from it. The coat smelled like pine trees and wood smoke scents that made her feel safer than she had any right to feel. "Mr. McCreary," she said as he helped her into his wagon. "Yes, Miss Rebecca?" "Thank you for asking my name." Daniel smiled, the first real smile anyone had given her in longer than she could remember. Everyone deserves to be called by their name. As the wagon rolled away from Morrison's trading post, Rebecca looked up at the vast Colorado sky and wondered if perhaps her luck was finally changing. She didn't know that Daniel had come looking for winter supplies. Not a wife, but had been so disgusted by Harold's treatment of his daughter that he'd intervened on pure principle. She also didn't know that waiting for her at the McCreary homestead were 5 children who desperately needed someone to care about them, and that she was about to discover her true worth had nothing to do with bearing children and everything to do with the size of her heart. The mountain wind carried them toward an uncertain future, but for the first time in years, Rebecca felt something she'd almost forgotten existed: hope. Daniel McCreary's farmhouse appeared through the pine trees like something from a fairy tale, with smoke curling from the chimney and golden light spilling from frost-covered windows. Rebecca's breath caught in her throat as she took in the sight. A real home. Not just a shelter where people slept and ate. But her wonder turned to concern as she noticed signs of struggle everywhere. Laundry hung haphazardly from a rope stretched between 2 posts. Children's clothes mixed with what looked like work shirts that hadn't been properly mended. The vegetable garden showed evidence of eager but inexperienced hands, with plants growing in crooked rows and weeds overtaking the corners. "They're watching us," Daniel said quietly, nodding toward the kitchen window, where 5 faces pressed against the glass like curious birds. Before Rebecca could respond, the front door burst open and children poured onto the porch. She felt momentarily overwhelmed by the chaos of their arrival. A teenager with Daniel's serious eyes, a girl about 13 who moved with the careful responsibility of someone carrying too much weight, twin boys who looked to be around 10, and a little girl with golden braids who hung back shyly behind the others. Everyone. "This is Miss Rebecca," Daniel announced, his voice carrying the gentle authority of a man who'd learned to manage both farm work and child-rearing. "She's going to be helping us take care of things around here." The oldest boy stepped forward first. At 17, Jacob had his father's height but carried himself with the tense shoulders of someone who'd been forced to grow up too quickly. "Thank you for coming, Miss Rebecca. We've been managing, but ... He gestured helplessly at the chaos surrounding them. "We've been trying our best," added Mary, the 13-year-old whose hands bore calluses that belonged on a woman twice her age. "But there's always so much to do." The twins, Ben and Beth, studied Rebecca with the frank curiosity of children who'd learned to be wary of strangers. Ben clutched a small wooden horse he'd obviously carved himself, while Beth held a book with pages so worn the title was barely visible. 6-year-old Emma remained hidden behind Jacob's leg, peeking out occasionally to study this strange new person in their world. "It's nice to meet all of you," Rebecca said, keeping her voice gentle. I hope we can help each other. What happened next surprised everyone, including Rebecca herself. Emma suddenly broke away from her brothers and sisters, running straight toward her with arms outstretched. The little girl crashed into Rebecca's legs with such force she nearly knocked her over. Are you going to stay? Emma asked, her voice muffled against Rebecca's coat. Are you going to be our mama now? The question hung in the cold air like breath fog. Rebecca felt every eye on her, waiting for an answer she wasn't sure she had the right to give. These children had already lost one mother, and the last thing they needed was more disappointment. I'm going to try my very best to take care of you, she said carefully. Would you like that? Emma nodded vigorously, then grabbed Rebecca's hand with the total trust that only children can offer to adults who haven't yet had the chance to let them down. Inside the house, Rebecca got her first real look at what would become her new home. The main room was spacious but cluttered, with furniture that had seen better days and personal belongings scattered everywhere. The kitchen showed signs of eager but inexperienced cook's burn marks on the wooden counters, dishes stacked haphazardly, and the lingering smell of meals that hadn't quite turned out as planned. But underneath the chaos, she could see the bones of a good home. Strong wooden floors, large windows that let in plenty of light, and a massive stone fireplace that clearly served as the heart of family gatherings. This was a house that wanted to be loved, that needed only a guiding hand to transform it from shelter into sanctuary. I know it's a mess, Mary said apologetically, wringing her hands as she watched Rebecca take in their surroundings. Mama used to keep everything so nice, but since she died, we just can't seem to ... It's not a mess, Rebecca interrupted gently. It's a home where people are too busy living to worry about perfect housekeeping. That's not a bad thing. Mary's face brightened with relief. And Rebecca realized the girl had been carrying shame about their domestic situation on top of all her other responsibilities. Are you hungry? Jacob asked. We usually have supper about now, but I should warn you, none of us are particularly good cooks. Rebecca rolled up her sleeves. Then it's lucky I am. Why don't you show me what supplies we have, and we'll see what we can put together. What followed was unlike anything the McCreary children had experienced since their mother's death. Rebecca didn't just cook, she taught them songs to sing while they worked. She didn't just organize their supplies, she showed them tricks to make kitchen work easier and more efficient. She didn't just prepare a meal, she created a sense of celebration around the simple act of feeding their family. But the real magic happened when Daniel returned from evening chores to find his house transformed. Not just clean, but warm in a way that had nothing to do with the temperature. The smell of fresh bread filled the air. Candles flickered on a properly set table, and his children were gathered around Rebecca as she helped Emma practice writing her letters. Papa! Emma called out, running to him with excitement lighting up her small face. Miss Rebecca taught me how to write my name, and we made supper together, and she knows a song about a mockingbird that sounds just like the ones outside our window. Daniel looked at Rebecca, who suddenly felt shy under his gaze. Her hair had come loose from its careful pins during the cooking adventure, and flour dusted her apron from the bread-making process. Sounds like you've had quite a day, he said, his voice warm with something that might have been gratitude or relief or simple happiness. It's been wonderful, Rebecca replied, meaning every word. That night, as the family sat down to their first meal together, Rebecca felt something shift inside her chest, a sense of belonging she hadn't experienced since childhood. Emma insisted on sitting beside her. Mary asked if she could learn the bread recipe, and even Jacob seemed more relaxed, as if having another adult in the house had lifted some invisible weight from his shoulders. But it was the conversation that surprised Rebecca most. In her previous life, meals had been silent affairs where children spoke only when spoken to, and even then, as briefly as possible. Here, everyone shared stories about their day, discussed plans for tomorrow, and listen to each other's words like they actually mattered. "Miss Rebecca," Beth said during a pause in the chatter, "are you going to stay with us for a long time?" The question brought back the uncertainty Rebecca had been trying to push away. She looked around the table at 5 faces waiting for her answer, some hopeful, some cautious, all genuinely interested in her response. "I hope so," she said finally. "If you'll have me." Later that evening, after the children were tucked into bed and the dishes were washed and put away, Rebecca sat on the front porch watching stars appear over the Colorado mountains. Daniel joined her, carrying 2 cups of coffee that steamed in the cold air. "They've taken to you quickly," he observed, settling beside her on the wooden bench he'd built years ago for his late wife. "They're good children," Rebecca replied. "You've raised them well." Daniel was quiet for a moment, staring out at the dark silhouettes of mountains against the star-filled sky. "It hasn't been easy since Anna died. Mary's had too much responsibility for someone her age. Jacob's had to grow up too fast. And the little ones ... double quotes. He trailed off, unable to finish the thought. "They need what every child needs," Rebecca said gently. "Love, attention, and someone who believes they're important for who they are, not just what they can do." As they sat in comfortable silence, Rebecca felt peace settle over her like Daniel's coat had earlier that day. The mountains rose around them like protective walls, and somewhere in the distance, a coyote called to its pack. For the first time since her father had put her in that wagon at Marston's trading post, she began to believe that maybe, just maybe, she had found where she belonged. But what she didn't know was that her presence had already been noticed by others in the valley, and not everyone approved of the McCreary family's new arrangement. Storm clouds were gathering that would test her newfound happiness in ways she couldn't yet imagine. The mountain wind that had once carried the sound of her father's rejection now carried the scent of pine trees and wood smoke scents that were beginning to smell like home. 3 weeks into Rebecca's new life, disaster struck when 6-year-old Emma climbed too high in the old oak tree behind the house and found herself stranded 20 feet above the ground, screaming in terror as her small hands slipped on the frost-covered bark. Rebecca was hanging laundry when she heard Emma's cries pierce the morning air. Without thinking, she dropped the wet sheets and ran toward the massive tree where 4 children stood looking up helplessly at their sister, who clung to a thick branch like a frightened kitten. "She went up there chasing the squirrel," Mary explained, wringing her hands with worry. "Now she's too scared to come down, and Papa's in the back pasture fixing fence posts. He won't hear us calling from this far away." Rebecca studied the oak tree, its rough bark offering plenty of handholds for someone who knew how to climb. Back on her family's Kansas farm, she'd scaled apple trees regularly to pick fruit and escape her mother's sharp tongue when household tensions grew too thick to breathe through. Before anyone could stop her, Rebecca kicked off her warm boots and began climbing. "Miss Rebecca, what are you doing?" Jacob gasped, his teenage voice cracking with amazement. "Getting your sister down," Rebecca called over her shoulder. Already 10 feet off the ground, Don, the children watched in astonishment as this woman they barely knew scaled the ancient oak like she'd been born to it. Rebecca's muscles remembered the rhythm of climbing, and soon she was sitting on the branch beside Emma, whose face was streaked with tears and tree sap. "I can't get down," Emma whispered, her small body trembling with cold and fear. "It's too high. I know it seems scary," Rebecca said gently, wrapping one arm around the little girl while keeping her other hand securely gripped on the branch. "But we're going to go down together, one step at a time. I won't let you fall." What happened next surprised everyone, including Rebecca herself. Emma wrapped her arms around Rebecca's neck and held on with complete trust, the way a child clings to her mother during a thunderstorm. For the first time in 3 years, Rebecca felt the weight of a child depending on her completely, and something deep inside her chest clicked into place like a key finding its lock. They climbed down slowly, Rebecca guiding Emma's feet to each safe hold while murmuring encouragement. When they finally reached solid ground, all 5 children were staring at Rebecca with new respect and something that looked remarkably like awe. "How did you learn to climb like that?" Ben asked, his eyes wide with admiration. "My papa taught me when I was about your age," Rebecca answered. Brushing bark from her skirt and trying to look like tree climbing was a perfectly normal activity for respectable women. He said every girl should know how to rescue herself. Jacob stepped forward, and Rebecca noticed he carried himself differently, now less like a boy forced to be the man of the house and more like a young man who finally had backup. "Thank you for helping Emma," he said formally. Most ladies would have just screamed for help or stood around wringing their hands. "I'm not like most ladies," Rebecca replied, then wondered if admitting that was wise. Mary smiled for the first time since Rebecca had arrived. "That's probably a good thing. Most ladies wouldn't last a week out here." As they walked back to the house, Rebecca learned more about the McCreary children in 10 minutes than she'd expected to discover in days. Mary had been running the household since age 11, trying to fill her mother's shoes while still figuring out how to be a child herself. Jacob worked alongside his father every day, but dreamed of becoming a teacher like his mother had been before marriage. The twins were opposites. Ben loved animals and building things with his hands, while Beth devoured every book she could find. And Emma was the baby who kept everyone's hearts both full and terrified. With her fearless curiosity about the world inside the house, Rebecca got her first real sense of what daily life looked like for this family. The kitchen showed signs of constant use but little organization, with dishes stacked everywhere and clothes hanging from every available hook and nail. The main room had comfortable furniture that had seen better days, and while everything was practical, nothing was particularly pretty or welcoming. "Papa tries his best," Mary said, noticing Rebecca's assessment of their domestic situation. "But there's always so much work to do outside, and we never seem to catch up on the inside work." Rebecca rolled up her sleeves. "Well, let's see what we can accomplish before he gets back from the pasture." What followed was unlike anything the McCreary children had experienced since their mother's death. Rebecca didn't just clean, she organized systems that would stay organized. She didn't just cook, she taught them techniques to make meal preparation faster and more efficient. She didn't just mend their clothes, she showed them tricks to make repairs nearly invisible and longer-lasting. But the real transformation happened when evening came and Daniel returned from his fence mending to find his house changed in ways that went far deeper than mere cleanliness. The air felt warmer somehow, filled with the scent of fresh bread and the sound of children's laughter instead of the usual quiet desperation that had settled over his home since Anna's death. He found his family gathered around the kitchen table with Rebecca, helping Emma practice her letters while the older children worked on their own lessons. Candles flickered cheerfully, casting dancing shadows on walls that suddenly looked less bare and more cozy. "Papa!" Emma called out, abandoning her slate to run to him with excitement. "Miss Rebecca climbed the big oak tree to save me when I got stuck, and then we made supper together, and she knows a song about a mockingbird that sounds exactly like the ones in our woods." Daniel looked at Rebecca, who had gone suddenly shy under his gaze. Her hair had escaped its careful arrangement during the tree-climbing adventure, and flour dusted her apron from bread making. But there was something different in her face, a confidence that hadn't been there that morning. "Sounds like you've had quite an eventful day," he said, his voice carrying warmth and something that might have been admiration. "It's been wonderful," Rebecca replied, and meant it completely. That night, as the family shared their evening meal, something fundamental had shifted in the dynamics of the household. Emma insisted on sitting next to Rebecca. Mary asked if she could learn the bread recipe, and even Jacob seemed more relaxed, as if having another capable adult in the house had lifted some of the weight he'd been carrying on his 17-year-old shoulders. But it was the conversation that surprised Rebecca most. These children felt free to share stories about their day, to ask questions, to laugh at each other's jokes, and to disagree respectfully about everything from the weather to the best way to train a horse. Daniel listened to each child's contributions like their words mattered, asked follow-up questions that showed he was genuinely interested in their thoughts and feelings, and created space for everyone to feel heard. "Miss Rebecca," Beth said during a brief pause in the chatter, "are you going to stay with us for a really long time?" The question hung in the air like smoke from the fireplace, and Rebecca felt every eye at the table focused on her face. Some expressions showed hope. Others showed the careful caution of children who had already lost one important adult in their lives. But all showed genuine interest in her answer. "I hope so," she said finally, looking around at these 5 young people who had somehow begun to feel like her family. "If you'll have me." Later that evening, after the children were safely tucked into their beds and the kitchen was cleaned and ready for tomorrow's meals, Rebecca sat on the front porch watching stars appear over the Colorado mountains. Daniel joined her, carrying 2 cups of coffee that steamed in the crisp night air. "They've accepted you remarkably quickly," he observed, settling beside her on the wooden bench. "They're remarkable children," Rebecca replied. "You and your wife raised them to be kind, thoughtful people." Daniel was quiet for a long moment, staring out at the dark shapes of mountains silhouetted against the star-filled sky. "Anna would have liked you," he said finally. "She would have appreciated how you see each child as an individual instead of just part of a group to be managed." As they sat in comfortable silence, Rebecca felt something she hadn't experienced in years beginning to take root in her heart. The sense that she belonged somewhere, that her presence made a positive difference, that she was valued for who she was rather than judged for what she couldn't do. The mountain wind carried the scent of pine and wood smoke, sounds that were rapidly becoming the soundtrack of home. For the first time since leaving her father's house, Rebecca allowed herself to believe that maybe her story wasn't over, maybe it was just beginning. But what she didn't know was that word of the McCreary family's unusual arrangement had already reached certain ears in the valley, and not everyone approved of a single man housing an unmarried woman, regardless of how innocent or practical the situation might be. Storm clouds were gathering that would test not only her newfound peace, but also the strength of the bond she was building with this family who had taken her in. The hammer blow that would shake Rebecca's carefully rebuilt world arrived on a gray November morning when frost painted the windows like lace and the first serious snow dusted the mountain peaks. Mrs. Henrietta Caldwell rode up to them, McCreary homestead on her bay mare, her rigid posture and pursed lips announcing trouble before she even dismount. Mrs. Caldwell appointed herself the moral guardian of Cedar Ridge Valley, and she did not approve of what she'd been hearing about the McCreary household. The sight of smoke rising cheerfully from the chimney and children's voices drifting from the house only strengthened her resolve to address this scandalous situation. "Daniel McCreary," she called out before her boots touched the ground, her voice cutting through the morning air like an axe through kindling. "I need to speak with you about this inappropriate arrangement you've created." "Here." Rebecca was feeding chickens behind the house when she heard Mrs. Caldwell's sharp voice carry on the wind. Through the bare branches of winter trees, she could see the woman's stern face and Daniel's surprised expression as he emerged from the barn, still clinging to his work clothes. "Good morning, Henrietta," Daniel said politely, though Rebecca caught the wariness in his tone. "What brings you out on such a cold day?" "Don't play innocent with me," Mrs. Caldwell snapped, her breath forming angry clouds in the frigid air. "The entire valley is talking about the unmarried woman you have living in your house with those children. It's completely improper." Rebecca's hands went still on the chicken feed. She'd known this moment would come eventually. But hearing her situation discussed so bluntly made her stomach clench with familiar shame. Inside the house, Mary was helping the younger children with their morning lessons. But Rebecca could see Jacob's face appear at the kitchen window, his 17-year-old features tight with concern. "Miss Rebecca is here to help with household management," Daniel replied calmly, his voice carrying the reasonable tone of a man trying to avoid conflict. "Nothing more, nothing less." "Nothing more?" Mrs. Caldwell's voice rose like a hawk's screech. A young woman living under the same roof as a widowed man, sharing meals, sharing daily life, caring for his children as if she were their mother? "It's scandalous, Daniel, and you know it perfectly well." Rebecca wanted to disappear into the gray November sky, to spare this good family the trouble her presence had brought them. She began gathering the scattered chicken feed, thinking she should pack her few belongings immediately and leave before she caused more damage to the McCreary family's reputation. But then Emma burst out of the house, her small face bright with innocent excitement, completely unaware of the tension crackling in the cold air. "Miss Rebecca," the 6-year-old called out, running toward her with a slate covered in wobbly letters. "Look what I wrote all by myself." Mrs. Caldwell's sharp eyes fixed on the child's obvious affection for Rebecca, and her expression grew even more severe, like storm clouds gathering before a lightning strike. "And what kind of influence is this woman having on your children?" she demanded of Daniel, her voice dripping with moral superiority. "What kind of example are you setting for impressionable young minds?" "A good one," came Jacob's voice from the porch, strong and clear despite his youth. The teenager stepped outside with his jaw set in determination that reminded Rebecca strongly of his father. "Miss Rebecca helps Emma with her letters every single day. She's teaching Mary how to make medicines from herbs, like Mama used to do. She climbed a tree to rescue Emma when she was stuck up there scared and crying." "Jacob?" Daniel warned quietly, but his son continued with the fearless conviction of youth, defending what he believed was right. "And she's the first person to make this house feel like a home again since Mama died," Jacob added, his voice cracking slightly with emotion. "She doesn't try to replace Mama, but she makes us feel like a family, instead of just people living in the same place, trying not to bother each other too much." Mrs. Caldwell's face flushed red with indignation. "Young man, you have absolutely no idea what you're talking about. There are proper ways to run a household and maintain moral standards, and this certainly isn't one of them. What's proper about 5 children trying to raise themselves?" Mary asked defiantly, appearing in the doorway with Beth and Ben flanking her like small soldiers. "What's proper about a 17-year-old boy having to be the man of the house when he should be thinking about his own future? What's proper about a 13-year-old girl doing all the cooking and cleaning because there's nobody else to do it?" Rebecca watched in amazement as the McCreary children, her children, she realized with a fierce surge of protective love, stood up to defend her against someone who represented everything she'd been taught to fear and respect. But she also understood the real danger Mrs. Caldwell represented. This woman spoke for the respectable families of Cedar Ridge Valley, and communities had power that individual households could not resist. "The point is," Mrs. Caldwell said, regaining control of the conversation with the authority of someone accustomed to having her moral pronouncements accepted without question, "decent people simply do not live this way. Either you marry this woman properly, or she needs to find somewhere else to go. Those are your only acceptable options." The word marry hung in the cold air like a challenge nobody had expected. Rebecca felt her cheeks burn with embarrassment. She barely knew Daniel McCreary, and he barely knew her. They were 2 people trying to help each other survive, not lovers planning a romantic future together. "That's quite enough," Daniel said firmly, his voice taking on an edge Rebecca had never heard before. "How I manage my household is my business, Henrietta. Not yours, and certainly not the entire valley's. It becomes everyone's business when it affects the moral character of our community," Mrs. Caldwell shot back. There are standards, Daniel. Rules that decent people follow to maintain the fabric of civilized society. And what about the rule that says we should help each other? Emma asked suddenly, her small voice cutting through the adult argument with the clarity that only children can bring to complicated situations. Miss Rebecca helps us every day with everything. Isn't that what church people are supposed to do for each other? Out of the mouths of children, Rebecca thought, watching Mrs. Caldwell struggle for an answer that would maintain her moral high ground while addressing a 6-year-old's innocent logic. But the woman recovered quickly, her years of practice in moral superiority serving her well. Child, you don't understand adult matters. There are proper ways for unmarried people to behave around each other, and living together certainly isn't one of them, regardless of the practical benefits. As Mrs. Caldwell prepared to mount her horse and leave, she delivered her final threat with the precision of someone who knew exactly how much damage her words could. "'Cause I'll be speaking to Reverend Matthews about this situation this very afternoon," she announced, "and to the other families throughout the valley. People have a right to know what kind of example is being set for their children, and what kind of moral standards are being maintained in their community." After she rode away, her horse's hooves echoing like gunshots in the cold air, the McCreary family stood in their yard like survivors of a sudden storm, uncertain whether the worst had passed or was yet to come. "Don't listen to her," Mary said fiercely to Rebecca, her young face set with determination. "She's just a mean old woman who doesn't have enough meaningful work to do with her own life, so she meddles in everyone else's business." But Rebecca understood the situation wasn't that simple. Mrs. Caldwell spoke for the respectable people of Cedar Ridge Valley, and their collective disapproval could make life extremely difficult for the McCreary family. Daniel could lose customers for his farm produce. The children could be shunned at school and church, and the entire family could find themselves isolated from the community they depended on for everything, from medical care to winter supplies. That evening, as Rebecca prepared supper with unusually quiet children helping her, she made a painful decision. After the children were safely in bed, she would talk to Daniel about leaving. It would break her heart to go, especially now when she'd finally found a place where she felt valued and loved. But staying might destroy the family she'd come to cherish more than her own life. What she didn't know was that Daniel was wrestling with exactly the same thoughts, and that Jacob had overheard Mrs. Caldwell's threats and was formulating a plan that would change everything for all of them. The first snowflakes of serious winter began falling as darkness settled over the mountains, and with them came the cold reality that the McCreary family would need each other more than ever in the months ahead. But would the pressure from the outside world tear them apart before they had a chance to see spring together? The mountain wind that had once carried hope now seemed to whisper warnings about the challenges yet to come. A massive pine tree crashed down just 20 feet from the house during the worst blizzard Cedar Ridge Valley had seen in a decade, missing the roof by mere inches, but effectively trapping the McCreary family inside their log home for what would become the longest and most transformative week of winter. Rebecca's heart pounded as she watched. Daniel and Jacob rushed to assess whether the fallen giant had damaged their only escape route. Through frost-covered windows, she could see snow piling higher than a tall man's head, with wind howling like a pack of starving wolves hunting through the darkness. "We're completely cut off until this storm passes," Daniel announced, brushing snow from his coat as he returned from checking the doors. "Could be several days, maybe even a full week, before we can dig our way out to the barn." The children gathered around the stone fireplace, their faces showing the worry they were trying to hide for each other's sake. Rebecca noticed how Jacob's shoulders tensed with familiar responsibility, how Mary's hand shook slightly as she mentally calculated their food supplies, how the twins moved closer together for comfort and warmth. Little Emma climbed into Rebecca's lap without asking, seeking the safety that had become as natural as breathing during her weeks at the homestead. "Well then," Rebecca said, keeping her voice steady and cheerful despite her own concerns. "Looks like we have plenty of time for all those indoor projects we never get around to finishing. What should we tackle first?" What happened over the next 7 days changed the fundamental relationships between all of them in ways none could have predicted. Trapped together in close quarters with nowhere to run and nothing to do but take care of each other, they discovered sides of themselves in each other that normal daily life kept carefully hidden. Rebecca learned that Jacob stayed awake during the worst parts of storms, listening for sounds that might threaten his family, a responsibility too heavy for 17-year-old shoulders. So she started sitting with him during the darkest hours, sharing stories about her childhood that made him smile for the first time in months. "You really climbed to the top of the church bell tower?" Jacob asked, his serious demeanor cracking into boyish amazement as wind rattled the windows. "Had to ring the bell when the preacher fell ill with fever," Rebecca laughed, remembering her father's horrified expression. "Scared half the town when they heard it clanging at the wrong hour on a Tuesday morning." She discovered that Mary had forgotten how to play, carrying grown-up worries that belonged to someone twice her age. During the second day of their confinement, Rebecca started a flower fight while they made bread together, white powder flying everywhere as Mary shrieked with surprised laughter, her careful control dissolving into pure 13-year-old joy. "I haven't laughed like that since Mama died," Mary admitted later, helping Rebecca clean flour from the ceiling beams where their battle had reached ridiculous heights. The twins needed adventures, even when trapped indoors. Rebecca turned their daily chores into treasure hunts and competitions, racing to see who could stack firewood fastest, playing elaborate games where cleaning became battles against invisible dirt monsters, and building blanket forts that served as castles for imaginary kingdoms they created together. "Miss Rebecca makes everything fun," Beth whispered to her twin brother, not knowing Rebecca could hear from the kitchen. "Even washing dishes feels like playing house when she's helping, and she never gets mad when we spill things or make mistakes," Ben agreed, his voice carrying the wonder of a child who had grown accustomed to walking on eggshells around overwhelmed adults. But it was Emma who touched the deepest part of Rebecca's heart. The 6-year-old had been carrying a broken doll everywhere, its cloth body torn and stuffing showing through holes that grew bigger each day. On the third day of the storm, Emma finally brought the doll to Rebecca, with tears streaming down her small face. "Can you fix her?" Emma asked, her voice breaking with the weight of loss too big for such a little person to carry. "Her insides are falling out, and I don't know how to make her better." Rebecca took the doll carefully, seeing immediately how much it meant to the little girl. As she worked with needle and thread, Emma watched every stitch with intense attention, as if memorizing the process of putting broken things back together. "Mama used to fix things too," Emma said quietly, her small fingers tracing the doll's worn dress. "But then she got broken, and nobody could fix her back to the way she was before." Rebecca's hands stopped moving as the full weight of the child's understanding hit her. She looked down at Emma, seeing suddenly why the little girl clung so tightly to everyone she loved, why she climbed dangerous trees and took foolish risks. She was testing whether the people she cared about would disappear, like her mother had. Sometimes broken things can't be fixed exactly the same way they were before, Rebecca said gently, resuming her careful stitches. "But that doesn't mean they can't be whole again, just different than they used to be." Emma touched the doll's newly sewn seam with one finger. "Different how?" "Well, your doll was perfect when she was brand new, but now she has this scar where we worked together to make her whole again. That scar shows she was loved enough for someone to take time and care to fix her, even when she seemed too broken to save." The little girl considered this with the seriousness that children bring to life's most important truths. "Are you broken too, Miss Rebecca?" The question came without judgment, only curiosity, and the desire to understand how the world worked. Rebecca looked around at the family she had somehow become part of these. Children who had learned to trust her with their fears and hopes. This house that had become more home to her than anywhere she'd ever lived. Maybe a little, she admitted honestly. But I'm learning that broken things can still be useful, still be loved, still be important to the people who matter. Emma nodded as if this made perfect sense to her. I'm glad you're broken like us then. It means you understand what it feels like on the fourth day. When cabin fever threatened to drive everyone to distraction, Rebecca taught them all to play charades. Daniel joined in reluctantly at first, then with growing enthusiasm as he acted out animals and occupations with surprising theatrical flair. The sight of their serious father pretending to be a chicken had all 5 children rolling on the floor with helpless laughter. I haven't seen them this happy since before their mother died, Daniel told Rebecca quietly that evening as they prepared late supper together. They needed permission to be children again. Rebecca replied, watching Emma help Ben build an elaborate fort from kitchen chairs and old quilts. Sometimes adults forget that healing happens through joy as much as through work and responsibility. By the 5th day, they had developed their own rhythm as natural as breathing. Morning brought lessons around the kitchen table with Rebecca, teaching Emma her letters, while Mary helped the twins with arithmetic that actually made sense when presented, as word problems about farm animals and winter supplies. Afternoons meant storytelling sessions, where each person took turns creating adventures featuring brave pioneers, helpful animals, and children who solved problems through cleverness rather than strength. Evenings brought music, with Jacob playing his harmonica while everyone sang songs that echoed off the log walls and seemed to push back the darkness gathering outside their windows. Daniel's deep bass voice harmonized with Rebecca's clear soprano while the children added their own voices to create something beautiful from their unlikely combination. The storm finally broke on the 7th day. But something fundamental had changed forever inside that snowbound house. They had become more than just people sharing the same roof and meals. They had become a family knitted together by shared laughter, common struggles, and the kind of deep trust that only comes from weathering genuinely hard times together without anyone giving up or turning away. When Daniel and Jacob finally dug their way to the barn to check on the animals, they found all the livestock safe and healthy, the carefully stored hay and grain sufficient to last until spring. But the real discovery was what they had found inside themselves during those trapped days. The knowledge that they could depend on each other completely, that their bonds were strong enough to withstand whatever challenges lay ahead. Miss Rebecca, Emma said as they all stood in the doorway, watching the men shovel paths through snow that sparkled like diamonds in the returning sunlight. Are you going to stay with us forever and always? Rebecca felt something settle in her heart with the finality of a door closing on her old life and opening onto something entirely new, a certainty that surprised her with its strength and clarity. Rebecca learned that Jacob stayed awake during the worst parts of storms, listening for sounds that might threaten his family, a responsibility too heavy for 17-year-old shoulders. So she started sitting with him during the darkest hours, sharing stories about her childhood that made him smile for the first time in months. You really climbed to the top of the church bell tower? Jacob asked, his serious demeanor cracking into boyish amazement as wind rattled the windows. Had to ring the bell. When the preacher fell ill with fever, Rebecca laughed, remembering her father's horrified expression. Scared half the town when they heard it clanging at the wrong hour on a Tuesday morning. She discovered that Mary had forgotten how to play, carrying grown-up worries that belonged to someone twice her age. During the 2nd day of their confinement, Rebecca started a flower fight while they made bread together, white powder flying everywhere as Mary shrieked with surprised laughter, her careful control dissolving into pure 13-year-old joy. I haven't laughed like that since Mama died, Mary admitted later, helping Rebecca cleaned flour from the ceiling beams where their battle had reached ridiculous heights. The twins needed adventures, even when trapped indoors. Rebecca turned their daily chores into treasure hunts and competitions, racing to see who could stack firewood fastest, playing elaborate games where cleaning became battles against invisible dirt monsters, and building blanket forts that served as castles for imaginary kingdoms they created together. Miss Rebecca makes everything fun, Beth whispered to her twin brother, not knowing Rebecca could hear from the kitchen. Even washing dishes feels like playing house when she's helping, and she never gets mad when we spill things or make mistakes, Ben agreed, his voice carrying the wonder of a child who had grown accustomed to walking on eggshells around overwhelmed adults. But it was Emma who touched the deepest part of Rebecca's heart. The 6-year-old had been carrying a broken doll everywhere, its cloth body torn and stuffing showing through holes that grew bigger each day. On the 3rd day of the storm, Emma finally brought the doll to Rebecca, with tears streaming down her small face. "Can you fix her?" Emma asked, her voice breaking with the weight of loss too big for such a little person to carry. "Her insides are falling out, and I don't know how to make her better." Rebecca took the doll carefully, seeing immediately how much it meant to the little girl. As she worked with needle and thread, Emma watched every stitch with intense attention, as if memorizing the process of putting broken things back together. "Mama used to fix things too," Emma said quietly, her small fingers tracing the doll's worn dress. "But then she got broken, and nobody could fix her back to the way she was before." Rebecca's hands stopped moving as the full weight of the child's understanding hit her. She looked down at Emma, seeing suddenly why the little girl clung so tightly to everyone she loved, why she climbed dangerous trees and took foolish risks. She was testing whether the people she cared about would disappear, like her mother had. Sometimes broken things can't be fixed exactly the same way they were before, Rebecca said gently, resuming her careful stitches. "But that doesn't mean they can't be whole again, just different than they used to be." Emma touched the doll's newly sewn seam with one finger. "Different how?" "Well, your doll was perfect when she was brand new, but now she has this scar where we worked together to make her whole again. That scar shows she was loved enough for someone to take time and care to fix her, even when she seemed too broken to save." The little girl considered this with the seriousness that children bring to life's most important truths. "Are you broken too, Miss Rebecca?" The question came without judgment, only curiosity and the desire to understand how the world worked. Rebecca looked around at the family she had somehow become part of, these children who had learned to trust her with their fears and hopes. This house that had become more home to her than anywhere she'd ever lived. "Maybe a little," she admitted honestly. "But I'm learning that broken things can still be useful, still be loved, still be important to the people who matter." Emma nodded as if this made perfect sense to her. "I'm glad you're broken like us then. It means you understand what it feels like." On the 4th day, when cabin fever threatened to drive everyone to distraction, Rebecca taught them all to play charades. Daniel joined in reluctantly at first, then with growing enthusiasm as he acted out animals and occupations with surprising theatrical flair. The sight of their serious father pretending to be a chicken had all 5 children rolling on the floor with helpless laughter. "I haven't seen them this happy since before their mother died," Daniel told Rebecca quietly that evening as they prepared late supper together. They needed permission to be children again. Rebecca replied, watching Emma help Ben build an elaborate fort from kitchen chairs and old quilts. Sometimes adults forget that healing happens through joy as much as through work and responsibility. By the 5th day, they had developed their own rhythm as natural as breathing. Morning brought lessons around the kitchen table with Rebecca teaching Emma her letters, while Mary helped the twins with arithmetic that actually made sense when presented, as word problems about farm animals and winter supplies. Afternoons meant storytelling sessions, where each person took turns creating adventures featuring brave pioneers. helpful animals, and children who solved problems through cleverness rather than strength. Evenings brought music, with Jacob playing his harmonica while everyone sang songs that echoed off the log walls and seemed to push back the darkness gathering outside their windows. Daniel's deep bass voice harmonized with Rebecca's clear soprano, while the children added their own voices to create something beautiful from their unlikely combination. The storm finally broke on the 7th day, but something fundamental had changed forever inside that snowbound house. They had become more than just people sharing the same roof and meals. They had become a family knitted together by shared laughter, common struggles, and the kind of deep trust that only comes from weathering genuinely hard times together without anyone giving up or turning away. When Daniel and Jacob finally dug their way to the barn to check on the animals, they found all the livestock safe and healthy, the carefully stored hay and grain sufficient to last until spring. But the real discovery was what they had found inside themselves during those trapped days, the knowledge that they could depend on each other completely, that their bonds were strong enough to withstand whatever challenges lay ahead. "Miss Rebecca," Emma said as they all stood in the doorway, watching the men shovel paths through snow that sparkled like diamonds in the returning sunlight. "Are you going to stay with us forever and always?" Rebecca felt something settle in her heart with the finality of a door closing on her old life and opening onto something entirely new, a certainty that surprised her with its strength and clarity. The word grateful hit Rebecca like a slap across the face. For 3 years, everyone had made her feel broken and worthless because her body wouldn't perform the single function society deemed most important for women. But as she looked around the kitchen, where she cooked thousands of meals, helped with homework, and bandaged scraped knees, something powerful stirred in her chest. "Tell me something, Thomas," Rebecca said, her voice growing stronger with each word. "In our 3 years of marriage, did I keep your house spotlessly clean every single day?" Thomas frowned, clearly puzzled by the question. "Well, yes, but that's not the important point here. Did I cook your meals every morning, noon, and night without fail? Did I wash your clothes and mend them when they tore? Did I help your business by being kind and welcoming to customers? Of course, you did all those things. But a woman's primary responsibility is to... Did I sit by your bedside when you had fever and chills for 2 weeks? Did I nurse you back to health without complaint? Did I ever lie to you, cheat on you, or betray your trust in any way whatsoever?" Thomas's face turned red with frustrated anger. A woman's main job is to provide her husband with sons to carry on his name and inherit his property. Everything else is secondary to that fundamental duty. A woman's main job, Rebecca's voice cracked like thunder, making the children outside jump at the unexpected sound, is to be a complete human being with her own worth and value. She turned to face her father directly, seeing him with clear eyes for perhaps the first time in her entire life. "You sold me to the highest bidder because you couldn't see anything valuable about me except what I couldn't do. But Daniel and his children see who I really am underneath all those failures and disappointments." Daniel stepped forward, his presence filling the room with quiet strength that had anchored this family through countless storms. "Rebecca has raised my children for almost a full year now. She's taught them to read better, helped them work through their fears and sorrows, made this house into a real home instead of just a place where we sleep and eat. She matters to us in ways that have nothing to do with biology, but she can't give you sons." Thomas shouted, slamming his fist on the table, hard enough to make the coffee cups rattle. "What kind of future can you build with a barren woman?" Little Emma burst through the kitchen door at that moment, her face wet with tears and fierce with 6-year-old indignation. "Don't you dare take Miss Rebecca away from us," she cried, running to wrap her arms around Rebecca's waist. "She fixes everything that gets broken. She reads us stories every night. She makes the best apple pie in the whole entire world." Mary followed Emma inside, her young face set with protective determination. Rebecca helps me with the hardest parts of taking care of everyone. Before she came, I had to do everything by myself, and I was so tired and scared all the time. Now I get to be a regular girl, sometimes instead of always being the responsible one. Jacob appeared in the doorway, his 17-year-old frame blocking the entrance like a guardian. If you try to take Rebecca against her will, you'll have to fight every decent man in this entire valley. We all know what real family looks like, and it's not about forcing people to go places they don't want to be. The twins squeezed past their older brother, their small faces serious with determination. Rebecca teaches us arithmetic that actually makes sense, Ben said proudly. And she helps us catch fireflies in mason jars on summer evenings, Beth added. Mama used to do that with us before she went to heaven. Thomas looked around the room at the united family facing him, his confident expression beginning to crack like ice in spring sunshine. This isn't right or proper. A man should have his lawful wife returned to him. A man should treat his wife like a treasure, not like disposable property, Daniel replied, his voice carrying the kind of authority that came from earning respect instead of demanding it. You threw Rebecca away once when she couldn't give you what you wanted. You don't get to pick her up again just because your second choice for a wife didn't work out the way you planned. Rebecca felt something fundamental shift inside her chest, like a door opening after being locked for years. She looked at Thomas, the man who had made her feel worthless and effective, then at her father, who had sold her like a broken tool that might still have some use left in it. Finally, she looked at Daniel and his children, who had shown her what genuine love really meant. I'm not going anywhere, she said, her voice steady and sure as mountain bedrock. This is my family now. These children need me, and I need them just as much. Thomas, you can keep your legal papers and your property rights. I choose to stay where I'm wanted for who I am, not condemned for what I can't provide. The silence that followed felt like the moment before dawn breaks over the mountains. Thomas's face went through several expressions before settling on angry defeat. Her father looked confused, as if seeing his daughter as a real person with her own thoughts and feelings for the first time in his life. This isn't over, Thomas muttered, but his voice lacked the conviction it had carried when he first arrived. Daniel moved to stand beside Rebecca, his presence solid as granite. Yes, it is completely over. And if you come back here bothering my family again, you'll answer to me and every decent man in Colorado territory who believes in treating women with respect. As Thomas and her father prepared to leave, gathering their rejected legal documents and wounded pride, Rebecca felt Emma's small hand slip into hers with absolute trust. You're staying forever and always, right, Miss Rebecca? The little girl asked, looking up with eyes that held no doubt about the answer. Forever and always. Sweet girl, Rebecca promised, meaning every single word with her whole heart. Through the kitchen window, she watched her pass right away down the mountain trail, carrying with it all the years of feeling broken and worthless and unwanted. What remained was a kitchen full of people who loved her exactly as she was, who saw her value in ways she was still learning to recognize in herself. The bells of Cedar Ridge Community Church rang out across the valley on a perfect Sunday morning, calling people to witness what many would later say was the most important decision their small community had ever been asked to make. Word had spread faster than wildfire about the confrontation at the McCreary place, about Rebecca's choice to stay, and about Thomas Brennan's angry departure back to Kansas. Now everyone had to decide what they really believed about family, love, and second chances. Rebecca sat in the wagon beside Daniel, her heart beating like a hummingbird against her ribs. She hadn't attended church since arriving in Colorado, too ashamed of her unconventional situation to face the judgment of proper folks. But today felt different today. She was choosing to stand up and be counted. Whatever the consequences might be, we could still drive right past and head up to the lake for a family picnic. Daniel suggested quietly as they approached the white church building. Nobody would blame us for avoiding potential unpleasantness, but I want everyone to see that Miss Rebecca is really part of our family now. Emma bounced on the wagon seat between them, her 6-year-old voice carrying across the morning air. I want them to know she belongs with us. Emma's absolutely right. Papa, Mary added from the back of the wagon, her 13-year-old face set with determination. We shouldn't have to hide who we are, just because some people might not understand or approve. The church steps buzzed with whispered conversations that stopped abruptly when the McCreary wagon pulled up. Rebecca felt dozens of eyes watching as Daniel helped her down from the seat, his hand steady and reassuring in hers. The children formed a protective circle around her, their loyalty visible to everyone present like a declaration of family solidarity. Inside the church, murmurs followed them down the center aisle like bees buzzing around honey. The McCreary family filled an entire pew with Rebecca positioned between Mary and Emma, feeling the weight of judgment from some directions and support from others, as if the congregation itself was divided down the middle about their situation. Reverend Matthews stepped up to his pulpit, his kind eyes scanning the faces before him. He was a wise man who understood that his sermon today would shape how this community treated the McCreary family for years to come, and the weight of that responsibility showed in his careful preparation. Today, I want to talk about Ruth, he began, his voice carrying clearly through the wooden building filled with expectant silence. Ruth was a woman who faced an impossible choice between the safe path and the right path. She could have returned to her birth family in Moab, where everything was familiar and expected and socially acceptable. Rebecca felt tears prick her eyes as the Reverend continued his carefully chosen words. Instead, Ruth chose to stay with Naomi, her mother-in-law, saying those famous words we all know. Where you go, I will go. Where you lodge, I will lodge. Your people will be my people, and your God will be my God. The Reverend's voice grew stronger with conviction. Ruth built her family through choice and commitment, not just through blood and biology. She became an ancestor of King David and Jesus Christ himself, proving that God can work powerfully through any family built on genuine love and mutual commitment. After the service ended, Rebecca stood outside the church with Daniel and the children, unsure what kind of reception they would receive from their neighbors. Some folks hurried past with quick nods, clearly uncomfortable with the situation, but unwilling to be openly rude. Others stopped to chat about weather and crops, treating the McCreary family exactly as they always had. Then Margaret Patterson approached, the wife of the mill owner and the closest thing Cedar Ridge had to a social leader. What she did next would influence how the entire community responded to their unconventional family situation. Miss Rebecca, Mrs. Patterson said formally, then surprised everyone by reaching for Rebecca's hands with genuine warmth. I've been watching your family all through the winter and spring months. I've seen how those McCreary children have thrived under your loving care. Behind her gathered a group of women who had clearly made a collective decision: the school teacher, the doctor's wife, the widow who ran the general store, and several farm wives whose opinions carried significant weight in Valley social circles. We've talked among ourselves extensively, Mrs. Patterson continued, and we want you to know that you're genuinely welcome in our community. We've all seen what real mothering looks like, and it has absolutely nothing to do with giving birth. It has everything to do with giving love, patience, and dedication day after day. Mrs. Henderson, the school teacher, stepped forward with her own endorsement. Mary's reading has improved tremendously since you started helping her with lessons at home. And Jacob has learned more about genuine responsibility in 1 year than some boys learn in 5 years of growing up. Emma talks about you constantly at the store, added Dr. Morrison's wife with a warm smile. She lights up like a lantern whenever she mentions Miss Rebecca. That kind of joy and security can't be faked or forced. The blacksmith's widow nodded agreement. "I've watched you at the general store, always patient with all 5 children, making sure each one feels special and heard. That takes a gift that not every woman possesses, biological mother or not." Rebecca felt overwhelming gratitude wash over her like warm sunlight after a long winter. These women had been watching, evaluating, and making careful judgments. Their public verdict was acceptance and support, spoken clearly for the whole community to hear and understand. Young Dr. Morrison himself approached their group professional approval. "Mr. McCreary, I hope you don't mind me saying this publicly, but your family has been the very picture of health and happiness this past year. Whatever arrangement you folks have created is clearly working wonderfully for everyone involved." Daniel's smile was broad and genuine, reaching all the way to his eyes. "Thank you, Dr. Morrison. We've been tremendously blessed to find each other when we all needed family the most." Across the churchyard, Rebecca noticed a small group of men talking in low, disapproving voices. Among them stood Thomas Brennan and her father, their faces dark with anger at the community's obvious support for the McCreary family's choices. Thomas caught her eye and made a gesture that might have been threatening, but it looked petty and powerless compared to the circle of genuine support surrounding her. "Miss Rebecca." Emma tugged on her Sunday dress with excitement. "Does this mean everyone in town likes our family now?" Rebecca knelt down to meet the little girl's eager eyes, her heart full to overflowing with joy and gratitude. "It means the people who really matter have good, kind hearts, sweet girl. And the ones who don't matter very much can think whatever they please without affecting our happiness." As the crowd began to disperse towards Sunday dinners and afternoon rest, families heading home through the mountain sunshine, Rebecca felt a lightness in her chest that she hadn't experienced in years. The community had spoken through its most respected voices, and they had chosen love over law, compassion over convention, understanding over judgment. "Ready to go home?" Daniel asked, offering his arm with the courtesy he'd shown her from their very first meeting. "Yes," Rebecca replied, the simple word carrying more meaning than any formal vow she had ever spoken. "I'm absolutely ready to go home." The wagon ride back to their homestead was filled with chatter and laughter, the children excited by the morning's events and the obvious approval they had received. Rebecca watched the familiar landscape roll past the mountains that had sheltered her transformation from discarded woman to beloved family member, the valley that had become her sanctuary, the winding road that led to the only real home she had ever known. Behind them, the church bells continued to ring their Sunday celebration, carrying the sound of acceptance and belonging across the entire valley. A woman who had once been sold like livestock had found her true worth in the hearts of people who chose to love her not for what she could produce, but for who she chose to become. 6 months later, on a morning when spring painted the Colorado mountains green with fresh hope and new possibilities, Rebecca stood in her flourishing garden watching something she never expected to see. Emma ran between the vegetable rows with both arms working perfectly after her winter accident, chasing butterflies and laughing like music carried on the mountain breeze. The arm had healed straight and strong, just as Mrs. Patterson had predicted with her skilled nursing knowledge. But something else had healed to something in Rebecca herself that she was only now beginning to fully understand and appreciate. "Mama Rebecca," Emma called out, holding up a handful of wildflowers she'd gathered from the meadow. "Look what I picked especially for you." The word mama still sent warm happiness through Rebecca's heart every single time she heard it. Not because she had given birth to this precious child, but because she had chosen to love her completely and absolutely, and Emma had chosen to love her back with the same wholehearted devotion. Daniel appeared at the garden gate, his face wearing the kind of smile that meant genuinely good news. In his hand, he held an official-looking letter with fancy government writing on the envelope. "What's that?" Rebecca asked, wiping rich soil from her hands on her work apron. "Letter from the Territorial Government Office," Daniel said, his voice carrying excitement he was trying to keep under reasonable control. "About our homestead claim application." Rebecca's stomach jumped with nervous anticipation. They had been waiting months to hear whether their land ownership would be officially approved by the government. Without legal title to their property, everything they had built together could disappear as quickly as morning frost in summer sunshine. Daniel opened the letter with careful fingers, his eyes moving across the formal words while Rebecca held her breath, and the children gathered around, sensing that something momentous was happening. "Well?" Mary asked, her voice tight with the worry she'd learned to carry about adult matters. "What does it say, Papa?" Daniel looked up, his weathered face breaking into the biggest smile Rebecca had ever seen him wear. "We got it. All 160 acres of mountain land. The homestead is officially and legally ours forever." Celebration that erupted in the garden was unlike anything Rebecca had ever experienced in her entire life. The children whooped and danced around like wild creatures. Emma threw her wildflowers into the air like natural confetti, and Daniel swept Rebecca off her feet and spun her around until they were both dizzy with pure joy and relief. But as the initial excitement settled into deeper satisfaction, Rebecca realized this moment meant much more than simple land ownership. It meant permanent, unquestionable belonging. It meant no one could ever force her to leave this place where she had discovered her true value as a human being. That evening, as the family gathered around their kitchen table for supper, Daniel stood up in the formal way that meant he had something important to announce. "I've been thinking seriously about what this official land ownership means for our family's future," he began, looking at each of his children and then at Rebecca with the love that had transformed all their lives. "It means we can make real plans for years ahead, genuine long-term plans for everyone." He turned to Jacob first, who had grown taller and stronger throughout the winter months. "Jacob, I want you to think carefully about what you want to do with your adult life. Stay here and work this land alongside me, or go to Denver for advanced schooling. Either choice is perfectly fine with me, and we'll find a way to make whichever path you choose work financially." Jacob's face lit up with possibilities he'd hardly dared imagine. "Really, Papa? I could actually go to the city for education if that's what I decide I want. If that's your dream, we'll make it happen somehow. I promise you that." Samuel looked at Mary next, his expression gentle with fatherly pride. "Mary, you've been managing this household like a full-grown woman since you were 11 years old. But you deserve the chance to be young and explore your own interests. Maybe music lessons or art classes, whatever captures your imagination and makes you happy." Mary blushed with pleasure but looked genuinely excited by these unexpected possibilities. "I'd really like that, Papa. I'd like it very much. Ben and Beth, you twins are both smart enough to become anything you want when you grow up. We'll make absolutely sure you get the education and opportunities to choose your own paths in life, whatever those might turn out to be." Then Daniel's eyes